I have heard a lot of camping stories, but what I experienced, the blue light, and that weird feeling of being constantly watched everywhere could never be forgotten. A long time ago, in 2017, I went camping with my wife at the Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. It was a place we had mutually chosen for its seclusion, peace, and quiet. The reservoir, tucked behind and between forests, seemed perfect for finding some time to ourselves in nature. Those first few days were amazing. We hiked and canoed all day, relishing the fresh air and the silence of the woods. The reservoir itself was calm and serene, the ideal spot for a weekend getaway. It felt like we had the entire place to ourselves. One evening, as darkness settled in, we returned to our tent, ready to call it a night. The tent had a thin lining at the top that allowed us to see the stars, so we lay side by side, gazing up at the sky and listening to the faint sounds of the forest around us. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and fresh earth, a night far removed from the chaos of city life. It was tranquil, the kind of moment that makes you stop and appreciate the beauty of the world. However, amidst that peacefulness, I felt something strange but kept it to myself. I didn't want to alarm my wife. While looking up, I noticed a soft, glowing blue light hovering in the distance, near the end of the bridge we had crossed earlier. At first, I dismissed it as a headlamp from another camper or hiker, but the light was unusually bright, steady, and unnatural. It didn't flicker like a flashlight or move like a person walking. I tried to focus on it, but couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Turning to my wife, who was half asleep, I casually asked, "Dear, have you seen that blue light out there?" "You must be dreaming with open eyes, honey." "Come and sleep," she replied sleepily, pulling me closer. I didn't press further and tried to dismiss the odd feeling. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The light stayed in the corner of my mind as I drifted off to a restless sleep. I jolted awake to an unusual, fearsome sound. My wife gasped softly beside me. Sitting up, I saw her staring at the same spot near the bridge, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw it again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The blue light. It's right there." My pulse quickened. Peering through the mesh of the tent, I saw the same blue light. This time, it was brighter and still unnervingly motionless. It floated at the far end of the bridge, about 30 feet away. My instincts told me it had to be something mundane, like a headlamp or a reflection on the water, but logic couldn't explain its stillness or brightness. We sat there, frozen in fear, unable to speak. My wife clutched my hand tightly, and I could feel her trembling. Then, without warning, the light shot straight up into the air, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It disappeared into the trees, leaving us both gasping in shock. My mind raced to process what had just happened. It felt deliberate, as though the light had a will of its own. Our dog, who had been lying quietly at the foot of our sleeping bags, suddenly bolted out of the tent. He ran halfway to where the light had been and stopped, staring into the darkness. For the next 10 minutes, he stood motionless, fixated on that spot, occasionally glancing down the side of the bridge. His behavior only heightened our fear. "What should we do now?" my wife asked, her voice shaky. The night had become deeply unsettling. The usual forest sounds had vanished, leaving an eerie silence. Though we tried convincing ourselves it was nothing, we both knew something inexplicable had occurred. Reluctantly, we lay back down, though neither of us slept much. The dog eventually returned but remained on edge, his unease mirroring our own. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. Sunlight streamed through the trees, birds chirped, and the forest felt alive once more. We briefly discussed the night's events, but decided not to dwell on them. Instead, we packed up our gear and left the campsite early, still haunted by the memory of the light. Even now, years later, the experience lingers in my mind. That blue light Whatever it was, felt otherworldly. We may never understand what we saw, but one thing is certain, it was no ordinary light. My friends have many camping stories to tell, but I didn't have any until my family was different from many others. Many people inherit bungalows or wealth, but I got a cabin in the deep woods. My great-great-grandfather built it, and since then, it passed down through many generations until I got it when my dad died. He had no siblings to share it with. For you, it might just be a cabin to stay in when you come for hiking, but for me, it was more than that. My dad used to come there and stay for months, and so did I, as I used to live with him after his divorce. Back then, I used to enjoy being there. He was a part-time counselor, so I often accompanied him on his travel diaries, which led me to have so many memories there. At that time, I used to wonder why Dad didn't stay there for his whole life instead of bustling between the city and the woods every week. At that time, I never thought much about the odd things that happened around the cabin, the creaky floorboards, the strange noises in the night, the things that seemed out of place. Yet, as I grew older and Dad started sharing his lone experiences in the woods, I began to pay attention and realized there was something more to the house than met the eye. Our family cabin was situated and built at a perfect spot, located at the end of a quiet road in South Londonderry, Vermont, sitting on the edge of a dense forest, with a river winding its way through the property. It was beautiful, rugged, and isolated, with nothing but the sound of the river and the wind in the trees for company. In the past, the cabin used to be very much alive with the echoes of my dad's and my grandmother's presence. After my grandfather's death, my grandmother managed it, and we'd make the long drive up every summer, sometimes even in winter if the weather wasn't too harsh. The cabin was always so inviting, with its rustic charm, the smell of wood, and the warmth of the fire crackling in the stone hearth. But as much as I loved the place, there was always this strange feeling about it, which my dad sensed so much that he couldn't stay there for a lifetime, even though he had the choice. My dad found the cabin uncomforting, unlike the home we built in Houston. Yet, for me, the cabin was home. But what was unsettling were the things that happened outside. The woods, the river, the stretch of land that seemed to go on forever. Just beyond the porch, there was always something weird about the place outside. Like the eerie silence at night, sudden howling noises, instant or weird shadows of dancing people, and many other strange things. I could feel it in my gut when I wandered too far from the house, and it wasn't just the usual creeping feeling you get when you're alone in a big, empty place. It was different, darker, as if I was being watched. The first strange thing I noticed was the changing air at night. It carried an unnatural stillness that made the woods' silence crawl under your skin. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I was standing on the porch, just looking out into the trees, when I heard a low growl coming from somewhere in the woods behind the cabin. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. Deep inside, I also knew it wasn't a lion or bear, because that sound was too deliberate, too frightening, and maybe too strategic. My dog, Dabby, was with me at that time. Although he was a loyal and brave dog, at that moment, he started growling too, staring into the woods with an intensity I'd never seen from him before. He didn't come inside the cabin despite me calling him multiple times. Instead, he sat on the porch, facing the trees, growling in low, rumbling tones like he was guarding something far beyond my understanding. There were many other things, such as the glowing eyes I'd catch a glimpse of through the trees. It was always in the same spot at the edge of the forest, where the light didn't reach. At first, I thought I was daydreaming, or maybe it was a reflection from the branches, but the more I saw it, the more I became convinced that something was out there. Those eyes weren't of any animal. An animal's eyes either have innocence or the craze of power, but those eyes were too bright, too smart, and too watchful, as if they were yelling out loud that they were watching me every second. After that incident, I started avoiding walking near the woods at night. But sometimes, during the day, I'd still roam outside to push the fear aside. I spent a lot of time alone at the cabin, especially during the summer months, when my family would leave me to explore. I'd ride my bike down the old dirt road, past the cabin, and up to the river, where I would sit on the rocks, listening to the water trickling over them. It was peaceful, and I felt safe there. But one other incident took that peaceful place away from me, too. One day, I found the rock towers there. It was around 2 miles away from our cabin, between the oldest rows of trees. It was a place where stones were stacked neatly, one on top of the other, arranged in perfect patterns. It was quite weird for me to discover it because you'd least expect such a thing in the woods. Unexpectedly, the stones were smooth, round river rocks that seemed to be placed intentionally, and each one was about a foot or two high. It struck me as strange because I knew they hadn't been there the day before. Even more bizarre, when I knocked them over, they were always rebuilt by the morning. No matter how many times I knocked them down, they would be back the next day just as perfect, just as symmetrical. I didn't understand who was building them. I asked my grandmother about it. She was alive in those years. She shrugged off my question by saying, probably just some kids from the neighboring cabin. I couldn't believe her words, because I felt something strange was happening there. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and there was no way anyone would be coming out this far, especially in the dark. After a few weeks of these mysterious stone towers appearing, I decided to investigate. I went down to the river one evening, hoping to catch whoever was making the towers. I was confident I would find that person or thing, but as I sat there, observing the rock towers, the air grew colder and I started to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt like somebody was watching me. There were eyes behind every tree, and all were staring at me. Suddenly, I heard a soft yet frightening growl from somewhere behind me. It was low, just like the one I'd heard that night on the porch, but this time it was much closer. My heart started racing, jumping back and forth like it was running at Usain Bolt's speed. I turned around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just a few trees standing there, their branches swaying in the wind. Ultimately, I ran back to the cabin, trying to escape whatever fear was chasing me. Dabby was acting strange too. His ears were flat against his head, and his eyes darted nervously to the woods. He refused to come inside that night, just like before. He stayed on the porch, watching the tree line and growling every now and then, as if he knew something I didn't. I could barely sleep that night. The growling continued, echoing in the distance. It felt like whatever was out there was getting closer, waiting for the right moment to come into the cabin. But the worst part wasn't the growls, the eyes, or the strange stone towers. It was the feeling that something was protecting us, something that didn't belong to this world. The more I thought about it, the more I began to suspect that it wasn't the forest itself, but something within it. I wondered if they were my great-great-grandparents' spirits, protecting us and watching over us all the time, or if it was something else entirely. In the days that followed, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't venture far into the woods, and when I did, I was always aware of that eerie presence watching me from the trees. But I never spoke to anyone about it, not my parents, not my grandmother. They wouldn't have understood. To them, it was just a part of the cabin, the house that had stood there for generations. But to me, it felt like a warning that some things in those woods should be left undisturbed. Years have passed since that summer, but I still think about the cabin. I still remember the staring eyes, the growling noises, and those mysterious stone towers that appeared every morning. I've often wondered if the spirits of my great-great-grandparents really were trying to protect us from something, or if my imagination was playing tricks on me. Either way, I've never been back to that cabin since. I can't bring myself to go. Something about it still haunts me, a feeling that lingers deep in the pit of my stomach. Maybe one day I'll return, but for now, I'm content to let the memories fade and prefer to stay in the home in Houston that Dad left me. We have many deep wood stories, but this one was horrible. It still gives me fear and goosebumps. It happened back in 2020 when my husband, our daughter, Sam, and I went to the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. We rented a small cottage for a week to escape the city buzz and slow our clocks to enjoy the beauty of nature. The cabin had tall pine trees all around, making the place more heartwarming, with cool and calm air. The cottage was petite and aesthetic, giving vintage vibes. It had a cool, old age, like fireplace and a porch overlooking a small, serene stream, or at least that's what I thought when we first arrived. The first day was very peaceful. Our night was enjoyable as we ate dinner, played cards, and laughed about the absurdities of daily life. Sam was excited to explore the woods the next day, and my husband and I were looking forward to some quiet time to read. However, that same night, as we lay in bed to sleep, our moods began to change. At first, nothing was obvious. It wasn't anything clear or tangible, just a sense of stillness that hung in the air. The silence crawled under my skin. I thankfully managed to distract myself from it and fell asleep. The next day went well as we spent much of it traveling, so I assumed it was just the usual adjustment to a new place. But then the same thing happened when I went back to sleep at night. I heard a distant sound that broke the silence. It was a soft woman's scream that grew louder with every passing second. Initially, I thought I was imagining it, but the scream wasn't in my head. It was real. I could hear it clearly, coming from somewhere just outside the cottage, a long, wailing cry. A scream of agony, the kind you'd expect to hear from someone in terrible pain. My heart skipped a beat. It raced so fast I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I sat up in bed, straining to figure out whether it was an animal or a woman screaming in the distance. But no, it was a woman's voice. The scream echoed through the mountain air, bouncing off the trees and rocks, and it sent a chill down my spine. It was so loud that even with the hum of the air conditioner blasting in the room, I could still hear it clearly. I turned to look at my husband, lying next to me. He was still sound asleep, his breathing steady and unaware of the disturbing noise outside. I wanted to wake him, but I hesitated. What if I was just overreacting? It didn't seem possible, but the scream continued, stretching on for what felt like forever. I sat there, numb and frozen, too terrified to move or even make a sound. The wailing was so intense, so raw. It didn't feel like something that belonged in the peaceful mountains. It felt like something from another world. The scream continued for over an hour, growing more intense as the minutes ticked by until it finally tapered off, leaving an unsettling silence. The air in the room felt thick. The stillness clung to everything. I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. There was no explanation. It didn't sound like a prank. There was something desperate and broken in that cry. Although I felt an overwhelming urge to go outside and see, I stayed in my room on my bed, paralyzed by fear. I convinced myself it had to be some kind of strange echo, or maybe someone in the woods. But deep down, I knew there was something out there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I wasn't alone in that cottage anymore. As I lay in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the forest around us, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. The room felt smaller, and I had an overwhelming sense of being stared at by someone or something. I kept looking at the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. Maybe it was my imagination, but I could have sworn I saw the faint outline of a figure through the cracks of the door. It was tall, too tall, and I could barely make out the shape, but something about it made my breath catch in my throat. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that something was right outside that door, just waiting for me to open it. I pulled the covers tighter around my shoulders, my pulse quickening, and I stared at the shadows in the corners of the room. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound in the night seemed amplified in the silence. I didn't want to seem foolish or irrational, especially after everything had seemed fine before we went to bed. But that scream still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. It felt like the air itself had become thick with malevolent energy, pressing in on me from all sides. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone about the scream. My husband would have dismissed it as a bear or some other animal, and maybe he would have been right. Yet, I couldn't deny what I felt and heard. And it wasn't just the scream that bothered me. It was the other oddities in the cottage that made everything uneasy for me. There was this wooden duck figure in the living room. It was tucked away on the mantel, partially hidden behind a collection of old books. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a quirky little decoration. But the more I looked at it, the more wrong it seemed. The duck's eyes were too wide, its beak too sharp, and the wood seemed unnaturally smooth, almost as if it had been carved with too much precision. The way it stared at me when I entered the room made my skin crawl. It was almost as if it had some kind of twisted awareness, like it was watching me, studying me. I couldn't understand why something as innocuous as a wooden duck would make me feel so unsettled, but it did. Every time I walked past it, I found myself glancing at it, expecting it to shift or move, though I knew it was just a carving. Still, the way it seemed to leer at me was enough to keep me from feeling fully comfortable in that cottage. That evening, I told myself I'd try to relax and enjoy the rest of our vacation. My husband made dinner, the kids played outside, and for a while, things seemed normal. But when the sun set, the air grew heavy again, and I couldn't help but feel that something was waiting in the shadows. The air conditioner hummed in the background, but once the house fell silent, I could almost hear the forest breathing outside. The fear I had tried to push aside the night before crept back into my chest. I didn't sleep well that night, and the next morning I packed our bags early. I didn't say anything to my husband or the kids, but I told him that I thought we should leave. It was a beautiful place, but it wasn't worth staying if it meant spending another night feeling like we weren't alone. The thought of that scream still echoed in my mind, and the wooden duck still loomed like a silent witness to something I couldn't understand. We left that morning, driving back to the city, the whole time with a feeling of relief that I couldn't explain. Even now, thinking back on it, I can't help but wonder what really happened there. Was it just my nerves playing tricks on me? Or was there something in the Smoky Mountains, something in that cottage that was watching us, waiting? I'll never know for sure, but I'll never forget that woman's scream, the shadow outside the door, or that damn wooden duck that never seemed quite right. Life gave me a lot of camping stories, but this one was horrible to the core. Back in 2019, my mom and I decided to go to North Carolina to my grandpa's place for camping. I was 32 at the time, and Mom was 57. Grandpa's home was a dream place to go camping. If a person is a writer or artist, they would really find it a sanctuary. My grandpa was a singer. When he made enough money to live without a job or projects, he moved there and started teaching music to children in the area. His home was in a remote area in the deep woods, surrounded by dense forest and trees. You wouldn't find any counselor or cabin there easily. I've spent a lot of time there over the years, and every time I visit, it feels like stepping into another world, far away from everything. Although my grandpa and his home were love, there was something strange about the woods. It feels like the woods always carry secrets with them, and if we city people try to go in, they haunt us. They're okay with human presence, but not okay if someone intentionally interferes in their space. I realized this more when my cousin, who's a hunter, claimed to have seen strange things while out in the woods, shadowy figures and odd symbols carved into trees. Some of my grandpa's old friends even talked about hearing odd noises in the night, like chanting or whispers carried on the wind, but I never took any of it seriously. I was just there for the peace and quiet. I figured it may happen there, but I was chill because nothing had happened to me yet. Back to my story. In 2019, Mom and I arrived at Grandpa's home late in the afternoon. She greeted us as if we'd come to her after ages. She prepared our favorite meals and sweets too. After lunch, we had a long chat, and then we grabbed some gear, loaded up, and headed out. My mom and I are pretty used to the outdoors, so carrying camping equipment through the woods was nothing new. We made our way to the deep end of the property, about 3 or 4 miles into the forest, to find a good spot to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip down the horizon by the time we found a place we liked, situated between some tall trees with a decent view of the valley below. It was a peaceful spot, and for a while we just sat there, enjoying the silence. We set up our tent, arranged the gear, and took in the surroundings. The forest was still the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only people on Earth. There was something comforting about that. We stayed there for some time, but then decided to move the camp, and that's when I started feeling off. You see, there's a hill at the back of my grandpa's property that overlooks the woods. I'd been up there before, my mom said, pointing. I simply nodded because we'd gone there many times. It was actually a good place because of its view. Going there at that moment seemed like a good idea because there were predictions of rain, and we didn't have a tarp for the tent. I thought it would be safer to be higher up. So, we packed up and started walking up the hill, probably 20 or 30 minutes from the original spot. When we got to the top, we unexpectedly found an old 1800s-style cabin. I'd seen it before, but only from a distance. It always gave a vintage vibe, but the woods and their eerie atmosphere made me keep my distance. The cabin was abandoned, with no doors or windows, and the roof was sagging in places. It had been there for as long as I could remember, a leftover relic from the past, probably built by early settlers who came there before my grandpa. It wasn't uncommon for people to use it for hunting or as a shelter, but it always gave me the creeps. It felt like spirits would haunt me if I stepped in. That day, seeing it in the fading light, it felt even more unsettling. Mom and I looked at each other after seeing the cabin. Yet, I didn't say anything. I guess we both had the same thought. Why not camp here for the night? It felt like a perfect spot, isolated, surrounded by thick trees and offering a decent view of the valley below. So, we decided to set up our camp inside the cabin, despite its obvious state of decay. It wasn't like we had many options, and at the time, it seemed like a harmless decision. We laid out our sleeping bags on the old wooden benches inside, and for a while, everything was normal. We chatted about old family stories, catching up and reminiscing. The evening passed, and the temperature dropped as the sun gave way to the moon and dark sky. We were well into the evening when I noticed something strange, faint, scary whispers, barely audible coming from the corner of the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind. The forest is full of strange sounds, especially at night, and the wind can make things creak and groan in weird ways. But as I listened more closely, I realized the whispers weren't the wind. They were too distinct. Mom was sitting across from me, fiddling with something, and I asked her, "Do you hear that?" She started looking around with a serious expression, no smile, just straight lips. "Yeah, I hear it." "What is that?" We both fell silent, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder. Hushed voices came from the far corner of the cabin, where the shadows gathered. The air grew thick, and suddenly, the forest outside felt even darker, like something was watching us. The whispers felt unfamiliar. They were soft, almost melodic, but strange, like they were coming from a distant place, or maybe from another time. I tried to calm myself, assuming it was just some animals, but the sounds weren't right. They didn't have the rhythm or tone of any animal I knew. The best I could compare it to was the sound of someone speaking in a low, chanting voice. But there was no one else around. We were alone, or at least that's what I believed, since I couldn't see any other camp or shadow of people. "Mom, what do you think that is?" I asked, my voice quieter now, the hairs on the back of my neck starting to stand up. "I don't know," she said in a low voice, looking uneasy for the first time since we'd arrived. "It doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard." Her words settled over me like a weight. We both knew this area well enough to understand that animals don't make sounds like this, and there was no one else out there. The whispers continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. Complete silence. I looked at my mom, and she looked back at me. Her face was getting paler by the moment. Neither of us spoke. I think we were both trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind, just our minds playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. After a while, we decided to leave the cabin and get some fresh air. We walked out into the night, trying to shake off the feeling that something was following us. We didn't hear anything else, no more whispers, no footsteps, no nothing, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every crackling twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. We made our way back down the hill, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Once we reached the bottom of the hill, I thought we were safe, but the unease still lingered. That night, neither Mom nor I slept much. We lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, our minds racing with thoughts of what we'd just experienced. We both agreed that something wasn't right about the cabin. It wasn't just old and abandoned. It felt like a hub of other souls. The next morning, we packed up and left early, eager to get out of the woods and away from the cabin. We didn't talk much on the way back to my grandma's house. We didn't need to. We both knew that something strange had happened, something neither of us could fully understand. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching us, waiting. To this day, I have no explanation for the whispers in that cabin, and I'm not sure I want one. Some things are better left unexplained. The forest in North Carolina may have its beauty, but it also holds secrets that I don't think I meant to understand.